Devil, my friend. Fashion. Things to wear. Possibly faces covered, but more importantly, covering up the bodies. Merch. We have that now. We are very, very excited to announce that Vampire and the Devil have partnered with our friends at Rockin' Horror Apparel. They are now taking care of the actual merch, the exclusive merch for the Vampire and Devil podcast, modeled by our very sexy devil right here.
Oh, yeah.
But we have all kinds of goodies to share with you.
Got the hoodies, we got some shirts, we got some tanks coming up, we got some booty shorts, we got all the stuff you want to wear from the Vampire and Devil podcast, thanks to Rockin' Horror.
Horns up, fangs out. It is about that time, Devil, my friend, as we discuss another level. Oh, fuck.
Apparently the thing weren't on that good.
Apparently not. I think one fell out. No. All right, Devil, my friend. It is about that time as we get to discuss another letter of the alphabet chosen by the faithful, chosen by the fallen, chosen by the sacrifice, as it's another alphabets of horror for the letter R. And our beloved Fangs and Infernos felt that zombies and viruses and crazy, insane, vicious dogs needed to be the topic of conversation. So I ask you there, Devil, my friend, is it evil enough for you when it comes to a residential zone?
Oh yeah, it's time to bring those 90 video game vibes into your house and get a little freaky, get a little deaky, get a little bloody with Mila Jovovich, and check out Resident Evil. Talk a little bit about that. It was the winner of our poll for R by a pretty good landslide on that one. I wouldn't go say it was a flawless victory, but it definitely was leader of the pack. No pun intended with the dogs, but
But no, absolutely. And this movie's overall been cool. It's always an enjoyable experience for me. There's a lot about this movie that I like, but to be honest, there's also a lot about this movie that drives me fucking nuts too, that I'm not particularly fond of. And I'll precurse all of this by saying, like, speaking for myself, Fangs and Infernos, like, I am not what you would call a gamer by any means. I pretty much topped out at like PlayStation 2. Not that Resident Evil wasn't involved in those games and in those stations, and I was always aware and I always knew how popular and played it a bit, and it was definitely very cool. But in the long run, I am just not what you call a gamer. That's just never really been my niche. It's just never really been my style. So the thing about me is I do enjoy Resident Evil personally as a guy who's not part of that world. So I enjoy it as a movie. There's other movies, and we've talked potentially about, video game infused showdowns that, we'll see what we think about that in the future. But there's other stuff that I'm more in tune with when it comes to that. But anyway, gaming, not really my jam, just not really something I've ever super been accustomed to. So I do like Resident Evil as an overall movie experience. I think it's cool. I kind of like the overall concept. And it's funny too, because like the movie has this very Maximum Overdrive feel for me right off the bat, where, you know, this person steals, the virus and steals, part of the secret, like stash, so to speak. But in their, as part of their escape plan, they smash one of the viruses as they leave. And the AI of the area, I forget off the top of my head what the area is called, but
Raccoon City.
Vatican City, yes, thank you.
Raccoon.
So the AI of it basically decides that the easiest way to contain the virus and stop it from spreading is to just kill everyone. So there's a very Maximum Overdrive feel that I get out of this movie, from, instant quick decapitations elevators turning into sky coffins that just plummet people to their doom, and just a lot of stuff like that. But it's an overall cool movie. It's enjoyable, and it definitely has moments that still stand the test of time to this day, and just other parts that maybe didn't age quite as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I definitely, when I was a young wee devil, I definitely played video games, and Resident Evil was definitely one of those video games that I liked playing a lot. You know what I mean? It was one of those ones where like you had to play in the dark because it was a very dark game, and if you had any lights on, you couldn't see shit. And
Yeah.
it definitely was. It would definitely, I mean, as far as video games go, it was the first video game that like actually scared the shit out of you while you were playing the game. I mean, there were definitely a lot of moments when, like I said, when we talked about the dogs, but the dogs in the video games jumping through windows and shit at you, you didn't know it was coming until all of a sudden, boom, they're right there, and you're like, oh fuck, drop your remote. I dropped a few remote controls. I've probably thrown a few remote controls in my day because of the game, but. Yeah, I mean, like I said, I was always, but then again, like, I was into it, but I wasn't into it enough where when the movie came out, it's like, okay, you did this character different and this character is supposed to be like that. I never really was that big into it where it was like, okay, yeah, I didn't mind it as much. Like you were talking about the beginning. The beginning to me almost kind of reminded me a little bit more of like The Stand where all of a sudden, the virus drops and it kills everybody and it tries to go out and stuff like that. But I mean, it definitely has that, with the AI like kind of locking down and she's kind of locking down the facility and then all of a sudden, Alice kind of wakes up and she doesn't really know what's going on and she's gonna kind of go with it. But like I said, when it came to this movie, it was always like like I said, well, I liked it, and it was okay. It was like, when it went through it all and stuff like that, I was like, okay, it wasn't that bad. And then like, then a little couple years after the movie, they released what would be a George Romero version. We found out that actually George Romero was supposed to possibly make this movie,
Yeah.
and that they didn't go with it because it was going to be too bloody and too scary and blah 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 blah. And it's like yeah, it makes sense because I mean, like I said, this movie's R rating. The zombies in this movie are kind of cool looking, but when they bite, it's horrible.
Yeah.
They're almost like they're mentally handicapped zombies throughout this, because like they're basically like these people are like got hundreds of these zombies around them and no one's getting bit like barely because they're able to hold off all these people where like in a real zombie movie, what I mean, people are getting bit left and right and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It makes it a little bit harder to get away with. And then like I said, with the blood and the guts and stuff like that with the R rating, I always precursor that the only reason why this movie got an R rating was because at the very end of the movie, you see like 2 milliseconds of bush, and theoretically speaking, if you show any region hair or anything like that, it has to be it's an automatic R rating regardless. So that's the same thing with like swear words. You can throw in a few, through, few fucks and this and that, but once you get to a certain amount, then it automatically rates it to an R rating. And that's what I
Yeah.
always felt like this. And it's like I said, not saying that there isn't blood in this and it's not
Yeah.
gory. I mean, it's definitely not. And then, like I said, the game itself wasn't super, super gory. I mean, it was bloody. I mean, later on, Resident Evils, they get a little bit more bloodier and a little bit more gorier. But like, the original video game was definitely still scary and still had that blood and still had that lust, which kind of makes sense because the guy who directed this also directed the first Mortal Kombat movie. And like I said, I mean, I love the Mortal Kombat movies, but like
Me
again,
too.
those the newer Mortal Kombat that just came out is more representative of how the video game was. It's supposed to be bloody. I mean, that game basically like threw parents do a freaking haywire where they were trying to get the parent advisory on video games and stuff like that because Mortal Kombat was such a violent video game and promoted violence, and people who played that video game were violent people. I mean, whatever, people were violent regardless. We probably got more violent because you were trying to take away Mortal Kombat versus how violent we were before that. And then you go into like video gaming now, like and stuff like that, where you're going around and Call of Duty and all that kind of stuff. It's a little bit way more violent, way more graphic than the stuff that we were doing with. So it's like you gotta all the kids nowadays got to thank the kids of the '80s and the '90s for that, because yeah, we had to go through some shit for some mildly, very graphic violence, versus like how it is now. But anyway, like I said, back to the movie. Like I said, I always thought the casting was really good. I liked Mila as Alice. I liked the Rodriguez chick that plays in this and stuff like that. So I always thought that, like, everybody they cast was cool cast and stuff like that. I thought they all pretty much looked the part of who they were supposed to be. But yeah, I mean, like for me, like I said, the video game aspect of it versus like the real life aspect of it, it's just like I said, even before I found out about that George Romero one, I was just kind of like underwhelmed by the amount of, like, scariness and violence and and blood in this movie, and it just kind of like goes in with a lot of those movies. I mean, unfortunately, when this movie came out in the early 2000s, it was about that time when they started making a lot of these video game movies, where you had mainly almost every one of them were shit. They were shit movies. You know what I mean? You had this movie that was a little bit better as far as some of the other ones, but then you had, like, the Doom movie that came out. You had House of the Dead that came out. That was
Oh, kill me right
horrible.
now when it comes to House of.
You had a couple of those ones and stuff like that, and it wasn't really until like Silent Hill where you
Yeah,
finally got like an actual real good video game adaptation of a movie, other than like Japanese stuff. I mean,
yeah.
they remade some video games and things like that were a lot cooler. But like nowadays, you have like you've got like the big one right now is that Left for Dead, which is like really really cool and stuff like that. So I think it's Left 4 Dead or whatever that one is now. But yeah, there's a lot of like cool video games now that are being made into like TV series and movies and stuff like that. They're definitely better quality than we got in the early days.
No, absolutely. Yeah, and nothing against Paul Anderson, the director, as well. Again, you brought up Mortal Kombat, which is even still to this day. I mean, it's arguably one of the best, if not the best, kind of adaptations of a video game that's put to film. That's still kind of considered right up there as kind of elite. People have different opinions. Mrs. Vamp is very outspoken about her disdain for Mortal Kombat Annihilation, but
Yeah.
we all, in our household, we love Mortal Kombat. We think that one's great. You're definitely right about the more recent Mortal Kombat. Like I said before, fuck House of the Dead. I love Silent Hill. I think that movie's bitching. I think that thing is so cool. But yeah, you're definitely right about that, and just kind of the way that it is. But Paul's we're talking about a Paul Anderson movie not for the first time either, because he did Event Horizon and our Fangs and Infernos. Remember when we were talking about that movie a while back? But yeah, so it's a cool movie. It's an overall cool like thing to it. I've always loved and noticed like little tidbits of things that I've always liked. Like I've always loved, Alice in Wonderland. And one of the things that I always thought was kind of fun about Resident Evil and about this movie as well, again, not being a gamer guy, so if the names or the styles of these characters were in the video game, that was just not something I was ever going to know about. But the fact that the Resident Evil movie has a character named Alice, has a character who keeps track of time, and a character that goes, that's referenced, a powerful character that's referenced to be red, is a lot of fun for me, being that I am an Alice in Wonderland fan. And that was always something I always couldn't help but get a little chuckle out of, and wondering if that's an intentional reference, or something that just happened to be a thing in this movie, or if it was something that happened to be a thing in the video game that they're referencing from the video game. Again, if it is something from the video game, it's just not something that I'm going to know about. But that's all right, because I get a little bit of enjoyment out of that because of how much I love Alice in Wonderland. But anyway, there's a heavy body count, to this movie, and there's also just cool ways that people are taken out in this movie. I mean, the locked in chamber scene by far is easily my favorite part of the movie. And you can call it iconic because it pretty much is in there. Even people who've seen Resident Evil who like it for what it is, love it because of what it is, hate it because of what it is, all pretty much seem to dig that scene where the AI is getting the best of these soldiers, where you get the one person who loses their head, you get the other person that gets cut through the midsection, and then you get the other character who you just think has got it all figured out, who's agile as fuck, who's like, I can duck under this, I can jump over this, you are not going to get me. And that laser turns into that laser grid where this guy has nowhere to go and just cuts this fucker into cubes, man. Like, I love it. It's one of my favorite cinematic horror-ish kills that has just ever happened, because I just think it's so awesome, but also because it's so hilarious, because you really kind of get that semblance of this guy has kind of figured it out, or figured out the skit or scheme. He knows where the lasers are going to go, so he knows where he needs to be. Not so much, Sonny Jim. It just doesn't work that way. You think you know better? Nope, this laser's got you beat. And I just love that scene. I think it's great.
Yeah,
But it's a strangely, the funny thing is, though, it's a strangely bizarre design as well, because once you get past those scenes, there is a slow burn that kind of takes over the movie a little bit. And it also, you get very heavy references of George Romero, where for a movie that he was designing, that then either he dropped out of or they decided to go another direction for, there's a lot of the dead references to this, like especially the scene of like the zombie dragging his foot and dragging the axe. I mean, that's almost shot for shot, dude.
yeah. I mean, like I said, when it gets to the zombie parts and stuff like that, yeah, there's a lot of that where it's like, yeah, it's definitely very. I mean, it paid a lot, paid a lot of attention to the George Romero films and things like that. But then, like I said, you had those scenes. But then it's like I said, when you had the horde of zombies and there's just like, people getting attacked and being able to defend off, and like they're not very good at biting, and even like even when they do bite, the bite marks and the tearing the flesh and stuff like that. You got to realize, okay, this movie was made in the 2000s, or late 90s, early 2000s, and Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead and all of them were made in the 70s,
Yeah.
in the early 80s, and yet those movies still look way better as far as like the graphics of these zombie bites and these like these affected bites and in the horror genre of the aspect of it. And I was like, yeah, it just took away from like all that, especially because like with the with technology getting a little better, not even really the CGI, but just makeup, appliances in general getting better and better and being able to do things a lot more and stuff like that. It just kind of like it was a downstep, when we
Yeah.
talk about like downstepping with movies where it's, we've talked about, American Werewolf in London, with all the great, the, puppetry and graphics and all that special effects and all that for that movie, and then 20-25 years later you got American Werewolf in Paris, which looks way worse. Like if you would
Yeah.
take that into film study now of like kids nowadays, and like go and see these 18-year-olds and you make them watch both movies, maybe not watch all the movie but just watch the transformation of the werewolf in London and then the werewolf in Paris and the transformation. People are probably gonna think though that like, wow, that's crazy. You can definitely tell that American Werewolf is older because of just the stylistic and the way it looks,
Yeah.
but it looks way better than any of the stuff that's in the new stuff. And that's kind of like how the Resident Evil was. It was just kind of like a downplay on the zombie aspect of it, and like the gore and the grime and stuff like that. It just kind of like, it kind of just kind of left a bad taste in your mouth when you were watching, it. And like I said, this is before we even knew about, when it came out years later about the George Romero script and all that kind of stuff. And then you're like, man, you're like, really? Like, I'm kind of curious. And like I said, like, it would have been a lot cooler to see, I think. And like I said, Resident Evil definitely had like, there's like 40 different Resident Evils movies out there now and stuff like that. And a couple of them got a little better when it came to, some of the graphics and things like that. But then, obviously I know some things are not going to be able to play out very well. And like I said, like even in the video game where you have the big bad monster, the main villain, it was just so badly CGI'd. And I understand like CGI was still somewhat newish to this, but like I said, to me, I think they could have just used that old school tactics and kind of like maybe merged both, CGI and a little bit of like, practical, effects and stuff like that and made it just a little better. It was just like the graphics in the video game for the bad guy were better than the graphics for the movie. And you
Right.
gotta realize they had probably 100 times more budget than they had in the video game. So it was just kind of like it's like I get it, that obviously this character is a big monster and it's not, it's a little bit different than your triangle head or anything like that from like from Silent Hill, where that's a little
Yeah.
bit more practical, where this is like this big huge giant monster that's got like body parts all over them. And like I mean I get the fact that it's a lot easier to make that character into a CGI character or whatnot. But yeah, it was just bad. I mean, it was like sci-fi bad, like Sharknado kind of bad, CGI for it, and it just kind of like took you away from it. But like I said,
Yeah.
like I said, overall, like I was never really like I said, I never really was like one of those guys when it came to Resident Evil where I was like, screw this movie and stuff like that. Because like I said, it's a fun movie. I like it. It's a good shoot 'em up. It's not a horrible adaptation of the video game, but like I said, I mean, it's so much better now that like I said when I was talking about is I was saying the Left 4 Dead, but it's The Last of Us that I was talking about. That's the video game that I'm talking about
Oh
now.
yeah.
As you talk about like that, or even like Fallout now, where it's a video game one, like those two right now are like blowing up in the atmosphere of like, especially The Last of Us. Like people who I never played that video game because that's a little past my video game timing, but people that I know that played that video game, that first season was almost like word for word exactly how the video game was, and it's just they were like everyone was saying it's literally like the best video game adaptation of like, ever made on us on the screen. So it's kind of cool that it's just crazy that it took 30, 40 years to finally get like like I said, I mean there's smidgets of good video games like we were talking about, there definitely are ones out there that aren't bad, but and like I said, Resident Evil has its up and downs. There were a couple ones that I didn't mind too much, and then there were ones that were even way worse than the first Resident Evil. So it definitely like has like a when it comes to the series, as far it definitely has a lot of ups and a lot of downs. But like I said, it's just that a video game that was supposed to scare the shit out of you, and supposed to be a little bit more graphic. That I think they could have upped upped that. But then again, like I said, I'm not even gonna say that it's Paul's fault.
No.
More than likely it was all the producers and all the big studio wigs and all that were like, oh no, we need to do this and we can't do that because we want to make this movie an R-rated movie and we want to make it where it can be shown in theaters and stuff like that, and and be able to do it. But it's like, oh yeah, you could have taken out good parts about it. And I mean that's the thing about it too, where it's like, yeah, I mean, you got Mila Jovovich, which is kind of crazy. Like we see her character, and she's from movies like The Fifth Element, and then
Yeah.
and things like this with that. But
Dazed and confused.
yeah, the one thing they did really really well, which I didn't find out until way later on, that they contained her nipples pretty good in this movie because
They
I mean,
did.
anybody that's ever seen her, she's got like big long ET nipples. So like you didn't find that out until like later on in movies. So I was kind of surprised, with a movie that had like the way that she was and the her being you know that half naked throughout the movie in the beginning, and then the dress she's wearing, obviously is the dress that she was wearing in the video game. So they obviously had to have that. But yeah, I mean, it was like I said, the adaptation of this film from video game, like I said, it wasn't on the scale of where it should have been and what it could have been, I think.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, when it came to a lot of the effects, to be honest, it was kind of like they blew their load on the dogs. Like I liked the dogs personally. I thought they looked good. I thought they were proper. They were definitely like vicious and pretty scary looking and stuff like that. So, but yeah, they definitely kind of like cheaped out in other ways, it felt like for sure. But I mean,
Yeah.
I like I've seen not I haven't seen any of the like whatever they're called, the cartoony type Resident Evil movies, but I've seen all of the Mila Jovovich Resident Evils, I think. If I haven't, it's maybe the last one, the most recent one I might have not seen. But like I watched all the Resident Evils like whenever they came out just casually. I didn't run to the theater kicking in the door for each one, but I remember going out and seeing them and enjoying them just fine. So I like the setup to the Nemesis character at the end of the movie, which we do get later, which I thought was kind of cool because I had always heard that even in the video game, they never really reference who the Nemesis is. So I thought it was kind of cool that they gave you some backstory and all the Fangs and Infernos are they all know that I'm a big like backstory nerd. I like hearing about how characters are created. So I liked learning about that and knowing about that down the line. But overall, I mean, it's cool. Like I said, it's a fun enough experience, but there's just so much bizarre and awkwardness that comes with this movie that, I can get enjoyment out of the movie because I don't have a background in Resident Evil, but then we also have, of course, Fangs and Infernos that are much more in touch with it, similar to you, Devil, that just kind of know a little bit more overall about how that game started, how you had to play it, leading into the movie and stuff. But I mean, to each his own, say la vie when it comes to that. So as we get to the obituary, as we get to kind of the way that this movie gets ranked and the way we kind of see it, for me, honestly, it's simple enough. I really don't need a huge soapbox when it comes to this. I enjoy the movie as a fan of the movie. I don't have that experience in Resident Evil, the video game, to bash it within an inch of its life because I have no grounds for comparison. But at the same time, as a horror fan, as a zombie fan, as a person that loves George, and as a person that just expects certain things when it comes to that style of horror movie, this movie left me wanting in a lot of ways. Like I said, there are kills in this movie that I think are fantastic. And I love Mila's portrayal of the character. I think she does great as Alice. A little bit of sin and skin never hurts either. So there is enjoyment in this movie. But I can't honestly go higher than a 6.5, which is what I'm going to give this movie out of a 10 on the obituaries because there's just so much more I want from this movie. And to be honest, Devil, I also feel I'm kind of owed by this movie that I just wasn't given, sticking specifically to the criteria of a horror fan watching a horror or kind of science fiction-y monster zombie movie. I just felt like I had more questions than answers.
Oh yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with you on that. Like I said, I mean, just like I said, especially when you look at, like I said, you look at the of the onslaught of video game movies, when it comes to prior to this or even around that same time, like you said, we talked about, the Doom movie, we talked about, House of the Dead and, Alone in the Dark video game, that the movie that came out. And like I said, yeah, a lot of them, like I said, I mean, yeah, you had Mortal Kombat. I mean, there were other ones that are, or I could say that you could talk about the video games that are bad too. Maybe they're not particularly horror, but you gotta look at I still throw them in the bunch of them in this category too, where like Street Fighter or the Super Mario Brother movie and things like that.
Oh man.
You can enjoy them for what they are, but
Yeah.
like I said, 99% of the time when a video game movie came out, you're like, regardless of whether or not it's a horror video game or any kind of video game, you're like, oh god, it's gonna be shit. And like I said, 9 out of 10 times they usually were. So like I said, Resident Evil definitely wasn't on that higher mark, but versus like how many video game movies were out around that time, it definitely is a higher standard versus some of the other ones. Until like I said, until you got a little bit later with the Silent Hill movies and
Yeah.
things like that, where it got a little bit better. And then, like I said, when we're talking about The Last of Us and Fallout and some of these other movies, and even movies now like Minecraft. I'm not a huge Minecraft people, but that movie looked pretty crazy and stuff like that. So you have that Ready Player One that was kind of like a homage to video games back in the day that was kind of cool. So like these video game movies now have gotten a little bit better in sense of that. So it's like yeah, so it's like yeah, I'm with you with that 6.5. I think is a good thing because like I said, it definitely could be worse. It definitely could be better. And like I said, and us saying and that's giving a 6.5. At least me personally speaking, giving Resident Evil a 6.5 is actually pretty high accolades compared to like I said, if we were doing Alone in the Dark, that'd be like a 2 or 3. House of the Dead would be like a negative 30 something. You
Oh
know what
my
I mean?
God, I would be
Yeah.
torching that movie.
You know what I mean? Like some of those other ones, even Street Fighter, I'd still put a little bit below Resident Evil. It's entertaining. I can watch it.
Exactly.
Like I said, with the Mortal Kombat movies, like I said, the first one I liked. Annihilation, I have a lot of big gripes about. I like parts of it because you bringing in characters that I enjoy from the video game. But then again, you have a character named Baraka who's got knives for hands and there's no blood. It's Mortal Kombat needs blood. That's the whole thing of it. Somebody must have took when they made the movie for that, they must have took the blood code out of it and took so that there was no blood. But anyway, like I said, 6.5 is actually pretty high for being what video games are. Now, like I said, you're gonna fall if we were doing something on Fallout or those guys. Yeah, we would give them a lot more. We'd give them 7s or 8s or eight
Yeah,
point fives. Even like Silent Hill, we'd probably give Silent Hill probably like an 8 or something like that. So 6.5, even though it does seem pretty low, it's
seems
actually
harsh.
high in the standard of video game adaptions.
100% for sure, and that's kind of the way it is. Because yeah, I mean, like I said, I love Silent Hill, and it would actually absolutely get a much higher rating because not only is it a better story, it's just a better overall execution of the product. So it would absolutely get a higher one. Again, just like you said, Street Fighter, I enjoy it for what it is, exactly like you said, Devil. It's just the way it is. So it's like, where yeah, we're giving Resident Evil like a 6.5. Street Fighter's going to get like a 5. Super Mario Brothers gets shit on and destroyed on such a regular basis. But again, it's kind of goofy and kind of fun for what it is. But again, that's going to live in the land of like 4, 3.5 kind of thing because it is just a like Mario was so established and had a very specific look to things that even the characters, the human-ish characters that they were basing off of Super Mario characters were so just badly designed that like it doesn't work. Like the Toad character had no similar representation to a mushroom in any way that it's just kind of laughable. But that's dissection for another day. But that's the way it's going to be, Fangs and Infernos. It seems like we're being harsh, but just like the devil spoke of, it's in comparison to what we expect out of horror movies, but also on a level to the other video game adaptations that were coming out at the time. So while it seems like 6.5, which is the way it's going to be, seems harsh, you got to understand the other movies that were coming out at that time and that they can't compete on those similar levels. So 6.5 for Resident Evil 2002 is the way that it is going to be on this obituaries for myself, the vampire, and for our beloved devil. Absolutely. So keep in mind, our beloved Fangs and Infernos, that we show so much love and support to all of our sponsors and partners that we want you to show love and support to them as well, whether it be Brutalities, Twisted Minds, or the Buffalo Bill Bed and Breakfast. But of course, if you like to dress sharp and look very good and very bloody, very evil when you are out and about, please make sure that you support and check out our friends Mark and Lizzie at rockandhorror.com because that is the only place that you can go to get exclusive Vampire and Devil podcast merch, whether it be stylish hoodies, t-shirt, tank tops, hats to hold back the hair, or the return of our currently sold out sexy booty shorts that say our beloved horns up, fangs out. Devil, my friend.
Oh, yeah.
I think if there's anybody who would know hot things, it's you.
Oh, yeah.
So I think it's only right that you let our beloved Fangs know what they can order now, courtesy of Coney Island.
Oh, yeah, man. We're in the kitchen. You know it gets hot in the kitchen. And what else better for your finger foods, for your tacos, for your victims that you may be eating? Maybe some sauce. And you should get it from the sauce boss. Coney Island sauce. Oh, yeah. Get some of that good stuff. Oh, yeah. You like to sprinkle it on anything. You could sprinkle it on your fingers. Sprinkle it on your toes. Sprinkle it on your hose. Anything you want to sprinkle goes.
Absolutely. We have partnered with Coney Island Saucery. Aaron is fantastic. We really appreciate all the love he's given to the show, and we're very, very pleased and honored to be a part of him. So he's got 4 sauces out of various heat levels to enjoy on all your various foods, but also for anybody who is already following his socials, our socials, or is about to be, newly announced partnership with Slayer.
Slayer, oh yeah.
Coney Island
burning to fire.
Oh yeah, Coney Island Saucery does have a Slayer brand hot sauce coming out very, very soon. And so make sure that you check that out for all your various levels of spice. This is Vampire and the Devil, Coney Island Saucery. Horns up, fangs out. Devil, my friend, I think we should have a little quick conversation about everybody's respectful celestial abodes, where it be my little coffin, where I lay my head at night, or at times that you feel that you just want to go back down to make sure that hell's not getting out of whack while you are away. Let's talk about it. Vampire and Devil's newest partnership in Twisted Vines, our dear friends, Chris and Sarah and Cadaver.
Oh yeah, you like scary stuff, you like horror decor, come and check out Twisted Vines. They make all the kind of cool shit, all for your house, all kinds of scary shit. They love it. You like to bring back the horror, you want to scare your neighbors, you want to conjure up a friend to talk to, you want to conjure up somebody bad, you want to do some bad stuff to them, you go to Twisted Vines and get some of their merch.
Absolutely, for sure. Everything is completely handmade by them. So if you need a little friend, maybe a round set abode, maybe you want to conduct a little evil towards a friend that was a friend, maybe no longer a friend. They have voodoo dolls they can do for you to allow for such activities. But you know how much we love our Ouija boards, my friend, and they make all of those by hand. They took care of your beloved vampire with a nice Nosferatu board, but the devil, he happens to be a Munsters fan. And not only do they do boards as traditional rectangles, but they can put a little bit of coffin flair in them.
Oh yeah, look at that coffin shape Munster board. Yeah, you wanna conjure up Mr. Herman? You wanna ask him how Pet Cemetery was? You can do it on this board. Oh yeah.
Absolutely, my friend. So again, thank you so much to Twisted Vines for partnering with the Vampire and Devil podcast, and make sure that you Fangs and Infernos are checking them out on their Facebook page, on their Instagram pages, and making sure that you are checking them out as they move around the country, showing their craft off at all of the various horror cons and oddities expos that they love to do. So absolutely, my friend, of course, man, horns up, fangs out for our friends at Twisted Vines.
Oh yeah. What's up? It's your boy the Devil here, and we're gonna continue our series of devils that are in the movies. This time we're gonna talk about Witches of Eastwick. Oh yeah, what's not to love about Witches of Eastwick? You got Susan Sarandon. Ooh, damn it, Janet. You got Cher. Oh yeah, I believe in love. And you got Michelle Pfeiffer, who wants a cool rider. Oh yeah. And they conjure up, a devilish man. Ooh, a Jack Nicholson's in this movie. Ha You gotta love Jack. He's crazy. He might get you with an axe. Who knows? He might even turn into a wolf. Who knows? Anyway, he's the devil, and he does some devilish stuff. But sometimes you don't want to cross those witchy women. Oh yeah, this is a good moral story. Do not mess with 3 witches or bitches or stitches or any of those things because they might come back and haunt you and use your magic against you and use your powers against you. And that's what happens to poor old Jackie Jack in this movie. Anyway, he has a good little bit of good time with those three. Who wouldn't want to do anything with Susan Sarandon, Cher, and Michelle Pfeiffer in the 90s? Oh, yeah, that's be heaven for me. They could kill me a million times. I'll enjoy every minute of it. But you should go check out Witches of Eastwick if you haven't checked it out yet, because the devil said so.
Oh, devil, my friend, it's going to be an absolutely ghostly, spooktacular episode and conversation that I believe we're going to get into as we are going to cruise, possibly time jump, and maybe just run around in circles a little bit on this ship's horror, or what do they call it, or nautical horror, however the beloved Fangs and Infernos want to break this one down, as we talk a little bit about 2002's Ghost Ship versus 2009's Triangle.
Yeah, bring out the captain and, set sails and make sure your, oars and all that good stuff is up in order. Cause yeah, we're going to talk about, some bad things, happen on land. Sometimes they happen in a car. Sometimes you got snakes on a plane. You got all that kind of shit like that. So why not while you're out there, it's getting to the summertime. It's getting to the nice warm weather where everybody wants to go out to their, go out to the beaches and or go out to your your cruise ship vacations. And sometimes those private, the guy asks you to go to his private yacht, and sometimes it doesn't work out very well. So we're going to talk about some mishaps within the boats, and like boats and hoes. It's not always boats and hoes, but sometimes it's more than you want, more than you get.
Absolutely. For sure. I mean, there could be some hoes involved. I mean, we've got a little bit of a ghost boobage that we'll be able to talk about in the upcoming moments, but absolutely, man, we're going to make everybody think twice a little bit on if they really need to take that cruise or not. So let's jump into Ghost Ship there, my beloved devil. This one's kind of the unofficial sister movie to 13 Ghosts. Now, don't get me wrong, for Fangs and Infernos that are aware of how much we love to talk about directors, but also are fans of just directors in their own right. Yes, this is also the same director who directed 13 Ghosts. And it's a cool like movie, but it has that feel, you know, of a 13 Ghosts movie. That's why I kind of bring it up as sort of like that unofficial, sister movie. I thought Steve Beck did a great job with this movie. I've always really liked it. It has a lot of like it's got a lot of like back burner shelved stuff with the way that it was originally designed, but I've always loved this movie. I think it's really great. I also think it's incredibly underrated as well, but people can, whether or not, because there's also a lot of camp that comes with this movie, where Triangle, when we get into that one, definitely has a lot more of a serious tone to it, but for a little bit of the camp factor that does come with Ghost Ship, overall I actually think it's a pretty cool kind of stellar movie, just as far as the way it's designed, the twists and turns, and a pretty cool, ending, in my opinion, based on like, how it may or may not continue when we get a little bit closer there. But again, when it comes to the Fangs and Infernos, as well as ourselves, anybody can say what they want about Ghost Ship in general, on whether they liked it, loved it, or didn't like it, or were indifferent. The opening scene to that movie is epically awesome, and I will die on the hill for that fight.
Oh yeah, yeah. When it comes to this movie, like I said, I mean, I've always enjoyed this movie. I wouldn't go as far. It's always like a love hate. I like it. It's a cool concept story. I mean, it's your basic story. It's basically almost kind of like I've heard simulations of it's like Event Horizon, but on a boat ship, which it very is very similar to that somewhat to an extent. But yeah, like I said, I mean, I've always liked it. Like I said, there are definitely some things about it that I was like, and it gets, eventually certain points of the time it gets a little slow burnish and kind of wears off its path a little bit. But yeah, like you said, I mean, as far as like, when people think about ghost ship movies or horrors on boats, Ghost Ship is one of the ones that a lot of people talk about. And like you said, it's one of those things where if anybody's talking about this movie, yeah, you could talk, like I said, when we get into it, maybe the ending, and then there's some iconic scenes throughout the film. But yeah, that opening scene is the thing that everybody remembers, just because it was such a cool. It was just a cool, scene, and the people who have seen it, is like that, it's just basically, this wire just goes freaking through like 75% of the occupants on this boat and just takes people's heads off and legs off and arms off and anything that's within that line. And I always thought it was just a
Cutting the
cool.
midsection.
Yeah, I just always thought that was just a cool, cool concept. Kind of like, when we talked about the cube a little bit, where,
Yeah.
somebody gets sliced and diced. It's like one of those ones where, you think about it. I mean, there's always been scenes, in other movies that have done that and things that we'll talk about, later on with other movies. Like, we're gonna eventually talk about Resident Evil that has like a kind of a scene that's similar to it. But yeah, I always thought that was just a cool way to like, introduce the, movie. It's just these like posh people on a boat and they're just dancing and having a good time and the little girl's dancing with with the captain or whatever he was and and then all of a sudden you see that kind of go and it flips through and you're just like, okay, maybe it might have nicked somebody because you see a little bit of blood, then all of a sudden you just see people body parts flopping to the ground. And I thought it was pretty cool at that time where it definitely used that CGI, but it wasn't super great CGI, but it wasn't bad CGI. It was like a CGI where it looked cool enough. You could definitely tell it was CGI'd, but it wasn't bad enough where it was like, a sci-fi CGI at that time or anything like that. Like, it's Sharknado sci-fi or something, something like that. It was a cool enough scene where it still looked pretty badass. And like I said, even, almost 30 years later or whatever, it still
Yeah.
looks pretty badass.
No, absolutely, man, for sure. When it comes to the overall concept of the movie, it's pretty basic, it's pretty straightforward. It's kind of this, to a certain degree, pirating type movie, and that's just kind of the idea behind it is this group of like sunken ship refuge scientist kind of people. That's just kind of basically, what they do is, investigating sunken ships, scavenging for what they could find, learning about things. They're also kind of like history buffs. You've got the main like captain of the crew who's like this old timer, very like seasoned guy who, kind of delves back into some demons, as he's on the ship that we'll get to a little bit later on. But, basically captains his crew, and the crew has been out on the ocean for God knows how long. They want time to themselves. They want to go home. One of them's one of them's engaged, and just other ones have like different situations, different home lives, and they want to get back to that. But they're basically being approached with by somebody that says, "Hey, I've found this ship, and I think there's a lot of really cool stuff, on this ship. It's, in my opinion, from my understanding, I believe it's this ship that went missing and never docked back in this time. And, I would like to hire you guys to come and, you know, check it out. And whatever you guys find you can keep. I want a little cut, as like basically like a finder's fee. But I really think that you guys should check this out." And they're just kind of like, it's just another gig, but it's not really that interesting of a gig, although the concept of it possibly being this missing ship does strike their fancy. Like, it does have them interested. But overall, it's still kind of one of those things where it's like, yeah, but the home life is calling, and sleeping in our real beds is very appealing. But they ended up, the price was right, the opportunity was there, just kind of enough poke, poke, poke to get them to take the gig.
Yeah, yeah, like I said, yeah, it's got that cool, like I said, you see them like, right before they get this gig, they're bringing in a ship, and you see like kind of what they do. Like you said, they're like salvagers and scavengers and things like that. And it's pretty, they're pretty ragtag, cool, like, you know, crazy, characters. Each person's got like his own like, skills that they bring to the table when it comes to this kind of stuff. So I always thought, yeah, I always like that. It's like that appealing, like, ooh, I was flying over and this the ship disappears, and they're like, oh, this ship has been, missing for, hundreds of years. Why all of a sudden, it comes out. They're like, okay, but it's kind of cool. And they go to it, and they have some murky waters getting into it, and then all of a sudden it just kind of appears out of nowhere, and they kind of slam right into it, and they're like,
Yeah,
holy shit, this is a big ass ship. And they're like, everyone's like, oh fuck yeah, dude, I mean, just this ship alone, tugging this ship around, we're gonna make a good penny. He's like, we're gonna make a good amount of money just for this ship alone. Probably each person's probably gonna bring home like a mill or something like that. And everyone's like, hell yeah. And then like I said, they go exploring in the ship, and doing what they would need to do, and see where they need to patch things up to kind of bring this ship in. And then they, luck behold, they find, ye old pirate gold, and they're like, fuck yeah, man, fuck the shit, man. We just want this gold because it's probably a couple $1 billion in gold bars and shit like that, and on the ship. And they're like, hell yeah, and none of them really kind of paying attention once they found the ship and found that gold. They're not really paying attention to what's going on to the ship, except for the one girl. She kind of notices a little girl kind of at one point, but just might think it might just be from just from being out on, by being out on the sea for so long. Maybe she's just kind of seeing things and stuff like that. But yeah, none of them are really kind of paying attention to, to all the stuff. Like, at one point, that one guy, he's faithful to his wife and smells cigarette smoke and doesn't pay attention that the singer from the beginning is there's, kind of smoking her cigarette, and like not paying attention to, to all that stuff like that. It's like, hey man, for guys who are supposed to be, ill intent on paying, minute attention to things and stuff like that. Yeah, they're pretty oblivious to the horrors that are gonna appear really soon. And that's what I like about this movie. It gets, at least for that part of the movie, it kind of veers off a little bit and you go into it. But once it starts getting into like they start noticing things, and it starts getting into the ghost, side of the story. Yeah, it starts getting pretty gnarly. You see some cool shit, and you see some stuff about, what happened to the people who were there. You see them getting shot in the pool, and, drowning in the pool and all that kind of stuff like that. And then you see a little bit of the ghost and dead bodies floating out of places that are in the water and things like that. So yeah, it's definitely, when it comes to these ghost things, these ships, it's, I always say it's kind of like, like horror in a mansion or something, like a big huge estate where, yeah, there's so many nooks and crannies in these big huge, because you got to realize these are like, cruise passenger ships that
yeah,
probably, can hold, 10,000, 20,000 people. So there's like, 9 million rooms they would have to check. And there's a lot of, little nods to things in here and there and stuff like that. There's a lot of you know references to, maybe some, things are probably going to go bad. Maybe they're, these some of these guys might, like you said, might have some demons in their past and stuff like that coming back to kind of haunt them.
yeah, and the movie does have a lot of just general shining references. I mean, you've got, so many just little nods and stuff like that. Like it's kind of hard to like ignore certain things. You've got the main kind of captain character who's like the head of the crew, who doesn't drink because they acknowledge that at the beginning of the movie, but then he's being kind of enticed by like this super aged like whiskey that's sitting in the cabin, and looking in the mirror at himself and realizing that's not him anymore. But with this crazy situation, it's like, man, I could just really go for a drink. And all these just like different vices, of which he ends up falling into the vices of that. You've got the two guys who are kind of like they're good workers, they're members of the team, it's a big family, but they're a little bit more of that playful kind of jolly chill guy, where they're not really shitbags in any way. They're just kind of, in their particular scene, they're kind of lazy, and they're like investigating this like hundred-year-old like canned stored food, and they're having like a competition on like who's gonna try it. But then they both tried it and they're like, oh, this is pretty good. But then it's almost got a little bit of that kind of kooky, almost Lost Boys reference, like, well, they're just noodles, Michael. When their food turns into like bugs and maggots and stuff like that, and that part's particularly weird. And again, you had mentioned it, Devil, the faithful guy who's newly engaged, but he's getting like kind of seduced by the singer from the opening scene, where it's like he doesn't really want to get involved, but he also kind of knows like it's a ghost, it's an illusion, like it doesn't make me a bad person, but it kind of does. And he's trying to like get involved, but yeah, getting back to like the Shining references, it's all just very, very kind of unique, because at one point the singer girl kind of shows a different side of her face, which is very, very similar reference to like the Shining, the woman in the bathtub. And again, the looking in the mirror and drinking, of course, is very reminiscent of Jack Nicholson, or Jack Torrance at the bar, with the bartender who may or may not actually be there. Just a lot of those like really like deep dark secrets that come out, but while the ghosts are also continuing to haunt. You keep getting these little bits of death, these little bits of backstory. You've got the pool that like is riveted with holes, but then like blood kind of starts seeping through the holes, but are ultimately end up like filling up the entire swimming pool with blood, and there's bodies inside. And then you've got the main like girl, kind of like the captain guy's like right hand girl, who like is starting to figure things out, because she keeps seeing the little girl who is basically the lone survivor of the initial wire decapitation scene. And but you still also learn little bits of what she may or may not have been involved in, because she's a survivor of that scene, but she's not really ultimately a survivor of the ship. They kind of show her corpse at one point hung in a closet, and it's like, did she do this because there was nobody else around and she didn't want to be lonely and continue on, or did somebody do this to her? It's a lot of like little intricacies and curiosities about what may or may not happen with certain characters.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like I said, it gets, like I said, it gets kind of cool. Like you said, you have the singer kind of enticing the guy, and then he's trying to touch her, and obviously Ghost can touch you, but when you try to touch Ghost when they don't want to be touched, you're gonna go right through it, and he goes right through it, right into a shaft, and gets all fucked up, and everybody's you got they're trying to get out of here, and the guys in the bottom that's fixing the ship all of a sudden like things get tweaked and gas gets turned on because Ghost, can do all that kind of stuff like that and blows up their ship. So now they're like, well, what the fuck, man? Now we got to patch up this big ass ghost ship and try to get out of here. And, all in the while, you have the guy that enticed them, that told them about the ship. You start learning more and more about him. And then all of a sudden you find out that he was actually on the ship
Yep.
during the time when it happened. And, there's like there's these Nazi people maybe or something like that where they're going around shooting everybody with freaking like with Tommy guns and all this crazy kind of shit, and it's killing. And then the woman, all of a sudden, like the guy's like, yeah, I killed everybody, and she's like, good, and shoots him in the head. So everybody like in this movie is like backstabbing the next person that's backstabbing the next person. And
Yeah, they're
because
double crossing the fuck out of each
yeah,
other.
because everybody wants more percentage of this gold, you know what I mean? It's like, yeah, 50 people dividing this gold is nice, but 25's even better, and 15's even better, and 5's even better, and the one chick's like, shit, two's even better. And then, everybody's like, fuck that, and kills each other. And then by the time they realize it, everybody's pretty much almost dead. And like I said, and it gets into to the end of the movie where you kind of find out that loner guy kind of is like this, devil's advocate kind of ghost that made a deal with like, maybe with a demon or a devil. It could have been anybody. It wasn't my doing. I wouldn't have liked that guy, so I would have told him to kick rocks. But apparently, he's got to collect so many souls and stuff like that. And you got all the people that are on this ship, to begin with, and you're like, you find out about all that kind of stuff like that. And getting to the end of the movie, you find out, they're trying to get like that. They find out that this guy is really who he isn't, and then they kind of kind of beat him at the end, and everyone's like, "Ooh, yay!" It kind of gets down to where they're like, "Yeah, kind of out," and then all of a sudden, towards the end, which like you're talking about, one of the cool parts of the twist at the end, where all of a sudden she's kind of like in the ambulance thing, and they're loading this ship, this new ship up, and you see the crates of gold going into the ship, and you're like, okay, what the hell are they doing with this crates of gold? You would think somebody would take that shit home. Why are they doing with this kind of stuff? And then you see that dude going into the ship again, the guy who enticed them, and you're like, Jesus, man, you're like thinking, like I said, all the people that he needed on the ship, all the people he's enticed before, because there were other people on that ship, obviously, after that, because the one guy in the movie finds like a watch that's obviously not a watch from like 1920s, it's like a
Yeah.
1980s watch. So obviously that, and you figure out like, Jesus, how many souls does this guy need, man? That he just keeps on going. But one of the cool parts of the movie when they finally do blow up that ship, and you think everything is good, and the little girl going up, you see all the ghosts ascending to back up to heaven or wherever they're going. And I always thought that was a cool iconic scene too, like that beginning
Yeah.
scene where it's just a cool little scene where you see all the spirits kind of being freed, and you're like, haha, that guy's not getting any of those souls now.
No, for sure. They're circling up to like exactly heaven or to lay themselves down to a peaceful rest where it kind of has this aurora borealis look to it. I mean, it's definitely cool. It's well edited. It's well shot. It's got a cool look to it. Devil. It's definitely a rad thing for sure. And yeah, ultimately, it's like yeah, they blow up the ship, which is what frees, or she blows up the ship, which ultimately frees all their souls, vaporizes this guy. But at the same time, the guy is a ghost already. And again, if he's a devil's advocate or just kind of like basically a guy who's, you know, doing the devil's or basically soul collecting, almost kind of more like for the almost a little less for the devil, almost a little bit more for the reaper. It's kind of like depends on how you kind of want to look at it. But he's basically like a soul collector. But yeah, you think everything's a wrap and she's like kind of like Titanic words like floating on the big door and they find her and yeah, she's getting like fixed up in the paramedics. But yeah, then she sees the same, you know, gold cases being loaded up on the ship with and the guy shows up and looks right at her in the ambulance and they lock eyes and it just kind of shows that it's like well he's doomed and cursed to live out this life so he has to do it all again and he lost thousands maybe millions of souls and now he's doomed to repeat himself and has to start collecting more souls which means he needs a new ship so
Yeah,
that's just kind of the way that movie ended. But I liked the ending of it. I always thought it was like a solid, kind of cool, like little twist of where you think it's just relaxation and yes, she's lost all of her mates and she's lost all this stuff, but hopefully she can just kind of get it together. But the other thing
yeah,
I always kind of liked about this movie, as we lead into the obituaries, is the idea of that kind of feeling of like a little kind of seven deadly sins kind of feel to it, where, because again, this guy is like, a soul collector and that kind of thing and you start realizing that there are little things where again you've got the two kind of goofy guys who really aren't like shitbags but they're kind of you know just kind of goofy and just kind of wanking off and so they don't ultimately kind of need to be killed and harvested but ultimately though still in the big picture everybody's guilty of greed. You've got the guy with the fiance who's kind of he's guilty of lust. The captain guy, addiction. It's just kind of interesting the way it comes across where it's like because it's about them collecting souls that are impure and not you know and not proper and the dirtier the soul the easier it is to collect and the more you're owed which is always kind of leads me back to a little bit of the curiosity when it comes to the soul of the little girl like what happened there because she wasn't the one behind the giant mutilation but what possibly led to her soul being collected again was she just murdered versus did she just give up on life which ultimately self-sacrifice in that way is actually considered a sin as well. There's a lot of little intricacies that I always thought were pretty cool But when we get to the obituaries, when it comes to this movie, like I've always enjoyed this movie. It's not an Oscar winner, but I do find it to be just a consistently enjoyed movie. I pop it in periodically. It's not a multi-time a year kind of movie for me. I mean, I might watch it more than once a year, but it's really just going to because there's like it hits me at like the time or the right place. But I'm not going to watch it in like, June and then most likely watch it again in like July or August. It might hit me again maybe in October or maybe later in the year in November or something because maybe I'm just in the mood or maybe it's on TV or something like that. But I do think it's an enjoyable movie. I think people in the big picture, the common populace, enjoy it for what it is. You don't have to think too hard when it comes to the movie, but it definitely makes you think as you're trying to figure out the little twists and ties and like why was this a thing or maybe you didn't notice this. But overall I do hold the movie at a pretty enjoyable 7.5, my friend.
Oh yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with you on that. Like I said, I mean, with the one thing that we didn't add with the ending that I always really super enjoyed too, is as you find out these crates are going through and you find the guys back into soul reaping, you got a little bit of Mudvayne playing in the background. So,
Yes.
and that's another thing that added to this. There was a lot of
Nice
good
new
metal.
metal
A lot of
soundtrack.
good new metal soundtrack to it, so I thought that was kind of cool. You know what I mean? At that time. So yeah, like I said, like I said. I mean, yeah, it's not the greatest movie ever. It's not going to win any awards for best acting and best script and stuff like that. It had some cool kills. That, like I said, it's got that iconic opening scene that is probably the most memorable thing of the movie. If you've seen the movie, or even if you haven't seen the movie, you've probably seen clips of just that scene before. So it's such an iconic scene that you could talk about. You can be like, oh man, you ever seen a movie Ghost Ship? And somebody be like, I don't know. It's like, oh yeah, the very beginning, you got out of the wire, and oh shit, yeah, I've seen that before. So it's got one of those like iconic scenes, like you said, it's one of those ones that yeah, I'll watch every periodically. Like I said, when
Yeah,
it comes to like like we talked about with this director, with the 13 Ghosts, I find 13 Ghosts a little bit more entertaining, a little bit more fun. That's a
agreed.
that's a that's a movie that I'll probably watch a lot more times a year versus like Ghost Ship. But like I said, if it's on and somebody pops it in and we're at a party or we're watching, just hanging around watching TV and we're on something and Ghost Ship is on. It's like, oh fuck yeah, let's play some card games and have a couple drinks and watch the movie or something like that. So yeah, I definitely agree with you as far as entertaining. So yeah, I definitely give it a 7.5 as I think it's a good score for it. Because like I said, it's just for that opening scene alone is
Yeah,
it's worth it's worth that. And like I said, I like a lot of the stuff. And like I said, it's got that it's got that Event Horizon kind of feel to it. That and like I said, the very ending it's pretty cool. You think everything is kind of good, and all of a sudden you find out he's back at sucking some souls again.
absolutely. So that's the way it's going to be to start us off there, Fangs and Inferno. 7.5 is how we're going to start it off with Ghost Ship. But now we're going to get from Ghost Ship to the Devil's Pick. And we're going to talk about Triangle from 2009. I got to tell you, Devil, you have a real cool knack for finding like interesting movies and stuff like that. Now, it's going to be a fun little breakdown when it comes to this movie because I definitely have like some interesting like thoughts when it comes to the movie. There's some stuff that I like versus some stuff that I didn't like. But overall, I definitely thought this was kind of a cool movie too. The idea of this basically of this mother, who's got like an autistic son who, it meets up with her. She's having a stress-filled day, and then she ends up meeting up with, friends of hers, and that are all gonna go on this like, this little sailing trip, which is always kind of funny because I always thought it was really hilarious that they called their boat like a yacht in this movie, where I was like, that's like a fucking schooner. Like it's like slightly bigger than like a what is it, the wind surfboards or
Yeah, yeah. I
whatever.
mean, like it had enough room for them to be up on top and maybe a little bit of a below deck. Yeah, definitely not a yacht.
Right. I was like, what the fuck? So, but anyway, they, and then they kind of get into this like electrical type storm, type situation. And, get smoked by a fucking like wave that just capsizes them and smashes their shit, and ultimately offs Heather like right off the bat. I think that was her name, Heather,
Yeah,
right off
nobody
the bat.
nobody cares. She's an unimportant character anyway.
Seriously, they tried to set her up with a hookup. They tried to set up the other guy with a hookup with Heather, and the last words you hear her say to the guy is, "Just for the record, I'm not interested." And then it's like, "Okay, well, fuck your life." Dead. Like just right after the wave hits, you never hear from her again. Of course, they're looking for her, for a little while in the movie, but yeah, you never see her at the end of Heather. Fuck that bitch. But yeah, so they're collecting themselves, and this giant ass ship comes in and looks like it's going to save them. They're all like, "Yay, stoked, rock!" Get on the little platform and cruise their way like up into the ship. And that's where like a lot of the bizarre, weird shit happened. Because one of the things that I found was very weird, where it was like it started getting into like the psychological stuff. Not so much the psychological stuff, kind of like how Ghost Ship was, where it was that supernatural mind fuck, ghosts and spirits fucking with the living. This one was more of that kind of almost like a weird psychological stuff that was a little strange to me watching with the way they were reacting, or in certain cases, not reacting, where they're walking around, certain people are walking in different places and there's like blood on the floor, or they've got like messages written in blood on mirrors, and they don't seem to be collectively reacting to it the way I felt like they should. Like having go to the theater written on a mirror in blood and have them just kind of be like, "Okay, well, the message says go to the theater. um I guess we should just listen to the message and we should go to the theater." I felt like it had this weird, not so much slow burn as in the traditional term for the movie, but almost like a slow burn on them processing what's going on. But don't get me wrong, once it got to the theater, shit got real, devil, and shit got real fast.
Yeah, I mean that's the cool thing I like about this movie. Like even when we talked a little bit about it in Ghost Ship, where there was a little bit of that subtle references to The Shining, where this movie had a lot of references to The Shining.
Yeah.
They go into room 237 in this movie. There's a time where there's like a pattern that you see of on the wall, and it's the same floor pattern as that. So, it has a lot of that. I mean, there's a time where, in the movie where the person is going after people with a, big, huge, giant axe, like Jack. So, I mean, that's the cool thing about this movie. And like people who haven't seen this movie, it's definitely one to check it out. I'm a huge fan of Melissa George, as the main actress in this movie, and and for all you Marvel people out there who love themselves some Thor, and with Chris Hemsworth, you got one of the Hemsworth brothers and Liam, one of his first appearance in a movie. I think this is like his debut in like a full feature film at the
Right.
time. So you know what I mean. You definitely you have that, and like I said, I mean, I guess going into spoilers, this is a not a particularly like with Ghost Ship, it's a ghost movie. This is what is considered time loop horror. And
Yeah.
at one point I was going to use this for my time loop movie. Instead I picked time crimes, and I was kind of glad. I'm like, well, at least I know, if we do a ship horror, I can throw this in there, because it's one of those ones I just randomly found one time on, just happened to see it on TV or something channel, and I was like, ooh, I like Melissa George, and let's check this out. And like, yeah, it's definitely, like I said, I mean, so going into this, it's definitely a different film than Ghost Ship. I
Yeah.
feel like yeah, I feel like Ghost Ship is one of those ones where you can watch and it's kind of like a mind numbing kind of dumb kind of movie you can enjoy and stuff like that. Where this movie, it's very complicated, and at times it's very confusing. But once you kind of, if you watched it once or at least watch it a couple times, it's one of those ones where you kind of learn new things when you watch it.
Yes.
But it's definitely got one of those ones where it's just an interesting concept. So like you said, they're going around the ship, and all of a sudden, you find out that there's somebody in the ship that's kind of going around, and you find out it's another one of Melissa George's characters. And you find out that everybody, every time they go on the ship, another one comes around, and like you have these cool scenes where you kind of don't know exactly what's going on. Like she finds her keys. Well, how did her keys get on the ship if she's never been on the ship before? Then she has these deja vus of being on the ship and like thinking this corridor looks kind of
Yeah.
familiar, and they're like, there's no way you could have been on this ship. And then eventually, like at one point where she's going further along and you're finding stuff, and she's reading these notes, and it's that this note that's written out about kill them all, and she kind of tests it out and realizes that it's her handwriting, but you
Yeah.
see thousands of scrap paper all over. So you're kind of like, okay, that's kind of weird. And then at one scene which kind of starts solidifying that this is kind of like a time loop, and it's been multiple times of this happening, is she loses her necklace. It gets trapped in a grate and it falls, and when it falls she looks down and there's like hundreds of the same necklace down on the ground. And then you have the scene where she's chasing after the one girl, and she's like, don't kill me, don't kill me, I'm not trying to kill you, but yet she kind of is. But she doesn't realize, the one that you see in this time isn't the killer yet. And you see, like, whenever she gets to her final resting place, that there's like a bunch of bodies of the same girl over and over again. And that's when you kind of go, okay, this is kind of weird, you know what I mean? Then you start realizing, okay, is it a time loop movie? Then you start seeing it through her end, where she turns into the one character. She's the one that writes the blood on that. You see that she can alter sometimes, because at one point the one guy tries to strangle her. At one point he doesn't. At one point he hits his head on the back of a thing. Another thing is different, so she can kind of alter things around a little bit, but it tends to always be the same. And that's what cool thing I like about this movie. Like, until you get into the later on in the movie, you kind of like going like, what the hell's going on? And she's like, she's trying to tell everybody like, although that's not me, it's somebody else, it's me, but it's not me. There's two of us here. And no, obviously, you'd be like, okay, this lady, she was already kind of mentally not out there to begin with. Even in the beginning of the movie, they were just like, something's weird about this lady, I don't know. And that's why I like it, when you gets into that, just gets into like this, very like, cerebral, it's very thinking man's horror
Yeah.
genre and stuff like that. But I always just love it, like I said, it's just a cool, when they start getting into it and start attacking, and she starts realizing, okay, now I need to do this or I need to do that. It starts getting into like this, like, okay, like, what's gonna happen now? We kind of know what's gonna happen, but maybe it's not gonna happen.
Yeah. No, for sure. Because even like Liam's character as well, like he's about the most accidental death of the entire movie, where
Yeah.
other people are dying from like they're still to a certain degree, accidental deaths, which is going to sound really funny saying it this way, but like, Fangs and Infernos, just hear me out. When you see this movie, or should you choose to watch this movie, you'll understand why I'm saying it this way. All of the deaths are kind of accidental, but it's kind of funny to call a shotgun blast to the face or to the stomach an accidental killing. But Liam's character is as accidental as it gets, because she's literally trying to like kind of pour her heart out to him and be like, no, like it's not me. There's another one of me, and we need to get off this ship, and we need to survive, and everybody needs to get together. And she like accidentally aggressively, backs him up into a wall, which impales him in the back of the head with like a nail or some type of, protruding spike kind of a thing. And like I said, that's about as accidental as it gets, because none of them knew that it was there. But it's such an interesting like loop as it gets around and you start learning about things, however much time it takes you guys or us, even as hosts, to kind of learn about these kind of things. And then you start realizing where she starts figuring out how to stop it, but ultimately turns herself in to the original killer that, you know, they were like, it's you're a psycho, you're a schizo, like you're doing this. And she's like, I wasn't even here. It's like, well, you weren't, but you were. And ultimately, it leads back around on the ship to where she thought she got the killer, ridded the killer, but then becomes the killer. And when she ended up getting bested by one of her doppelgangers, for lack of a better term, is where you start getting um the story filled in the big picture, where she's knocked overboard, she washes up on land, she finds a way to get home, which still boggles my mind on that scene. The fact that she's like also like running all the way home in these like wooden, I forget what the shoes are actually called, but like these just wooden platformy type sandals. And she gets home and she's looking in her house and also kind of seeing that she's kind of a shitbag to her son. And, you know, tries to rid her son of this horrible version of herself. And then ultimately just has the opportunity to stop it all completely, but all she ends up doing is starting the overall big cycle right over again.
Yeah, I mean that's the cool thing about this movie, especially like in the very beginning, the one character that gets killed, they talk about, the painting, I think, or something that was on the wall about, Greek mythology and about, him pulling the boulder up, that his punishment was to push a boulder up on the top of the hill, and every time he got to the top, the boulder would fall down and crush
Yeah.
him, and he had to repeat it again. And that's what I can't remember the name of the actual like Greek, thing that's about, but that's what the name of the ship is called.
Yeah, it was like
A
Aotus.
Aotis or Aos, Aesop,
Aetius, or
or
yeah.
yeah, something like that. One of those ones like that. But I thought that was kind of cool, and that's where it goes, where she kind of figures out like if she kills everybody, if everybody dies, another version of them comes. So she figures, there's a way to get out of this. And like you said, in that one scene where she does drift, she goes, she does drift. She runs back home. She realizes that, she's still at home, the kid's still at home, so she's trying to figure out a way that does. So she distracts the kid, like in the beginning of the movie, like you saw her go outside and like nobody rang the doorbell, and you found out that it was her ringing the doorbell. And like I said, you find out that she's like a shit mother, that she's slapping her kid because he's autistic and he drops shit and does them, does shit like on a toss, like as an autistic kid would do, you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
she's kind of like, she realizes that okay, I'm going to be a better mother, and so she kills that first one. So you think that she's going to replace that one and be a better mom, and she's going to take the kid away and stuff like that. And while she's driving, a bird splats into the a seagull that you see splats into the window, and ultimately she goes out, and all of a sudden there's a big huge giant wreck. And that's when you find out, all of a sudden like that. And I always like that because it's cool. It's a cool concept. Like basically, like the way that I kind of figured is like in the movie, like, okay, so when that all happens, that a taxi driver comes and he's like gonna take him. He's like, "Where do you want to go?" And she's like, "I gotta go." She's like, "I'll figure. I'm okay. I'm gonna go to this taxi. I'm gonna go to this boat because if I go on the boat, I'll go on the yacht. I'll go on that big ship. I'll be able to kill everybody, and I'll be able to come back to the house and I can fix it." And basically, the taxi driver, which if you notice him in the movie, he's kind of like nonchalant about a dead person being on the ground because like her other dead body was on the road and the kid was dead, and everybody's all kind of like, oh my god, I can't believe this happened. And he's just kind of like, hey, where do you want to go, lady? Like kind of like, you go like that. And basically what it is she died originally, and he's basically given her a chance to, I'll take you somewhere, but you got to promise me that you're going to come back. And she never comes back, which breaks the promise, which breaks death's promise, because this guy's basically death. And he's like, well, now your penance for not doing that is basically like the Greek mythology, where she's just going to constantly build. So she keeps on thinking that she's going to be able to save her kid and do all that. So she goes back on the ship and loops it again, goes around, does it again, has the kid, does that. The taxi driver again gives her the option to do it, but what she want to do, she thinks that she could save the kid. She thinks she could save herself. and ultimately, she's just gonna keep on looping herself over and over again. So I like it because it's like not only it's like a crazy psychological horror to it, it's got that time loop to it. It's almost kind of like a very like almost theological kind of thing where you're talking about like going to heaven or hell and people not being able to accept the terms of like she's basically letting her go do stuff but come back because it's your time, you died, and yet she just wants to defy death. And everybody knows even when you beat them in games of charades and put them as a bass player, you don't cheat death.
Yep, never cheap death. Absolutely not. You may be a king or a little street sweeper, but sooner or later you dance with the Reaper. It's a very cool movie. It's a very, very cool concept for sure. But Devil, my friend, like as we get into the obituaries when it comes to Triangle and then ultimately pit it up against Ghost Ship in the big picture, how do you look at this movie?
I mean, for me, like I said, I think it's one of those ones like, I mean, most people are like you said when we've done some of these movies, most people are gonna know what Ghost Ship is.
Yeah.
Ghost Ship is probably gonna be most people's jam. It's your typical basic horror film, mindless, horror film that you can just kind of watch and have a good time with. And like I said, and that's fine and dandy. I like a lot of those. I like those kind of movies, and I like Ghost Ship. I think Ghost Ship is a good movie. Like I said, we gave it a seven. We both collectively gave it a 7.5, which is a pretty good rating. To me, I mean, I feel like this movie is way more superior. I just like it as a film. It's such a cool concept. It's very original. It's something that you don't ever really see. You see a lot of the, Ghost Ship's got some cool stuff in it that you don't really normally see, but that storyline is pretty much, basic, people trying to kill people, ghost ships and things like that, that kind of stuff. I mean, I had a little bit of twists and turns of things that you don't see as much, but like the overall concept, I think, has been done over and over again. Where like Triangle is such a interesting movie. I remember like like Ghost Ship, like I said, other than that first iconic scene, unless you watch it just recently, you kind of don't really remember most of it. Where Triangle, I remember the first time I saw that movie, I was like, dude, this is one of the craziest movies I've ever seen in my life, just because it was so interesting. Like I said, with, you find all those, her dead bodies and all the other dead bodies, and you find this like, she's on this continual loop and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, such a cool concept to a movie because it's just things that you don't really see that very well or see that very often in in a horror film and stuff like that. So that's why like I said, for me, like I said, I give this movie such a good praise. Like I said, it's not going to be everybody's cup of tea. I already know that, but it's one of those ones that like, if you're into something that's kind of like makes you think a little bit, and into different ideas. I implore everybody to go out and see this movie. So for me, like I said, I mean, I'm gonna give, I gave Ghost Ship 7.5. Like I said, I just feel like this movie overall is just, I don't know. I just, like I said, it's one of those ones that like, yeah, a lot of people won't watch it over and over again. I'll watch this movie a couple of times a year just because I just kind of I'll watch another movie where there'll be somebody in a ship and something will happen, or I'll see Melissa George in another movie and then I'll think, oh my God, I haven't watched Triangle for a while. I love Triangle. And like I said, even when we were doing that time loop, I was like, dude, I really want this freaking movie in that time loop. But I knew a movie like Time Crimes being the fact that it's a foreign film and a very, very kind of niche kind of film that most people won't know, that is going to have a little bit less to talk about. So I was like, okay, I'll do that one. But I was like, I really wanted to circle back. And like I said, then I was like, what, we can do a episode on on a ghost ship or something like that, or ship horror or it's kind of like
Yeah.
that. So I was just like, oh yeah, now I can go and talk about this. So to me, like I said, I give this movie a high rating. I give it an 8.5 just because I truly enjoyed it. Like I said, I mean, it's just one of those movies where it was like, wow, this is a really crazy movie that I've never heard of in my entire life. Had some bigger actors, like I said. Melissa
Yeah.
George is a big actress. Like I said, it was, it's, Liam, at a young age, but he's kind of big and stuff like that, and a couple of other people that have been in this movie. But yeah, it's just one of those ones that like I don't know. I just found this movie very enjoyable, and it's like I said, it's such a different movie, and yeah, it's like I said, it's not going to be everybody's cup of tea, but I always just found that it was just a movie that I like, and I was like, I hope that people will check it out if they haven't checked it out.
For sure, Devil. I definitely am with you on a lot of that. So, my idea of this movie is actually kind of more similar to your take of Uncle Sam when we were discussing Uncle Sam and Silver Bullet, but I'm going to explain why. Film wise, I absolutely agree with you. I would definitely say it's a superior film for sure. The concept, the ideas, the acting, the execution. Now, I know that ultimately would be, well, that should be your be all end all right there to the people that are listening to us. But here's the thing, there's certain things about the way the movie's kind of crafted and designed that make it, I think, in my opinion, a little bit of a hard sell to people. And I definitely agree with you that I implore people to check out this movie. And Fangs and Infernos, I'm on Devil's side 100% with that. I agree with him that I really think you guys should check out this movie. I do think it's a little bit of a hard sell overall. There are parts of this movie that I do think are a little bit played out nowadays, which is a discredit to a movie from 2009 that had nothing with it then. But now, where you kind of have those happy death days, you've got more of those, constant death, circle back around, live your life over again. Movies are a little bit more common now, which I think takes away a little bit of the impact of the movie. I do think a bit of the idea of the movie is a little tricky as well, because again, just kind of the way I felt the original acting was playing out, I thought was a little bit weak, to be honest. Not bad, but just again, I understand the fact that they're walking around, they're exploring, and they're trying to figure out where they're at and why things are the way they are. But it just seemed very strange that they wouldn't react as I feel people should react to blood or certain things around, let alone with this ship conveniently coming through. Now, that being said, I do love the mythology. I'm a big mythological fan. I love that kind of stuff. And I love the way it was tied in overall with this movie. Me personally, I give this movie a 7 only because I do find Ghost Ship to be ultimately a more good time when it comes to horror fans. But at the same time, and like I said, that's part of the hard sell to the common populace of horror fans. Now, that being said, that's still a 7 and an 8.5 out of 7.75, which I know ultimately is not something that we typically do either. But in the ballpark, though, that still does overall rank this movie higher than it would Ghost Ship. And while I do think showdown wise, you're going to get a lot more impact to Ghost Ship as far as overall horror enjoyment. And again, that opening scene is iconic, as well as the ending is very strong. There is that, again, mindlessness to the movie that you really don't get in Triangle because you really have to be paying attention. If you're trying to watch Triangle while fucking around on your phone, people are just going to be like, this movie's boring, this is stupid, like I don't understand anything. Well, it's of course you didn't understand it, you didn't pay attention to it. So ultimately I do think that 7 is how I look at it, but something more in that range of a solid 8 I do think is more proper for Triangle.
Yeah, yeah. No, so I'll, so where are we gonna go before I go into my spiel? Where are we gonna finally mark this? What's it
Hmm.
gonna be, an 8?
I mean, I like it.
Okay,
I
okay.
definitely like. I think an 8 is a solid for this. Just taking it down just a notch because I do think that the horror populace it's a bit of a hard sell, like I said.
Yeah.
But
So
again, the film itself is of very high quality.
yeah, yeah. So I mean, so a person, I just want to implore this into you too. Maybe this
Yeah.
might bump. I mean, like I said, we can keep it at an 8, but might bump up your little you know, what you believed of these guys being, you know, mindless, stupid idiots throughout the movie and stuff like that about, you know, why they didn't realize that something says blood and blah 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 and not really paying much attention. So being a person who's seen this movie many times already, so here's what I'm gonna implore on you. Like I said, this movie is very, that's what I like about this movie. There's really no say exactly what's happening. It's all like you're kind of like it's taking, you know, what you think is going to happen. Like I said, that, you know, it's our, you know, understanding that the taxi guy is kind of like a reaper or death, and she's defying death, and one person's take. It's really not exactly ever explained exactly like that, which I like movies like this where one person can take it, one person cannot. So that's why I ask you with this, where okay, you know that she's looping all the time. But it doesn't really explain why they're looping all the time. And let me explain why I believe why they're looping and why when they get on the ship, those guys are a bunch of idiots and not really paying attention to the signs. So when she decided to say fuck death and just go on this cruise ship, that black mass that basically comes over them, they all die. They're
Yeah.
already dead when they're before they even get onto that ship, and that's why they're kind of not. Why am I eating this food that's just laying out on a fucking thing? Why am I reading? Why am I going to a theater that says "Go to the theater" written in blood? You would think my most people would be like, okay, if it was written on like, you know, chapstick or something like that, or like lipstick or something like that, you would go, okay, but that you could definitely tell it's blood. They know it's blood. You're gonna be like, why the fuck am I going to the theater, man? Like this is blood. I'm getting the fuck far away from that. But that's I
They
think that's
definitely have a mindless zombie feel
so
to
I
it.
think that's the reason why they're so kind of stupid in this movie, why they keep making those other three characters keep making dumb mistakes that ultimately keep on getting them killed, is because they're just they're just mindless pieces. They're pawns in this chess game. You know what I mean? They're
Right.
just their characters have no meaning whatsoever. This whole thing is just Melissa George's character and her penance for not going to death when death told her to and breaking death's promise. These guys died because of her stupidity, and they're just stuck in her loop.
Right. Well, it's one of those things where I wouldn't go so far as to say these people died because of her stupidity. I mean, I think, but I like everything that you said because I think it holds a lot of value to it.
Well,
It
they wouldn't have
definitely,
died.
but I think
They
it
wouldn't
has
have died.
I think I look at it a little bit more as a guilt by association thing because she fucked up and broke this promise. She now has to live this life. Well, remember though, I forget his character name off the top of my head, but he invited her out to um to go sailing. So
Yeah,
that kind of definitely has a bit of that final destination feel to it where now, death can be like, perfect, fuck these guys, these are exactly the cogs in that I need to make this, clock go the way
yeah.
that it
See, to me,
goes,
so yeah, yeah. To
where,
me, it
yeah, I
feels
don't
like
necessarily look at it quite as the whole, like, that type of a thing. I just think it's like a guilt, a guilt by association. Like
yeah.
they just wrong place, right time for death, kind of a thing.
Yeah, to me, yeah, see, to me, like I said, when it comes to that, where that thing, death isn't allowing her to go and see these guys. So
Right,
what death was allowing her to do is to go to these guys and tell them, no, I can't go with you guys. I've got something else to do. I'm supposed to do. But since she doesn't do that, she's basically forsaking those guys, and that's what kills them ultimately.
right,
If she wouldn't have gone on the ship with those guys and went with death, those three or four people would have just sailed and then came back the next day and would have been perfectly all right. None of them would have died at all. But because she broke death's promises, she
yeah.
basically ultimately fucked them over.
Definitely. No, for sure, Devil. And I definitely like that. And it definitely does give me more to think about. But also on that, the only thing I don't fully agree with that being a thing is if that was the case, in my opinion, then there really wouldn't have been any reason to off Heather completely. It would have just kind of allowed another person for her to toy with, in this overall death scheme. So, but again, that doesn't necessarily make it inaccurate. The tidal wave killing everybody still could have happened with death being like, well, I don't need everybody, and having certain people looking for somebody, looking for Heather, which her bestie was doing just that
Yeah, they
throughout a
get
good
them onto
chunk
the
of the
ship.
initial part, definitely is valid and definitely, allows for that ability to kind of have that mindless zombie seeing things, but not necessarily being as disturbed as you should be because they're still looking for their friend and thinking, well, does this blood also belong to my missing friend? Like, is this Heather's blood all over the place? So it's definitely stuff like that. So that being said, the other little intricacies, yeah, definitely probably does give me a reason to look at it more of a solid 7.5 in it. But that being said, regardless of the overall outcomes, Devil, I think you did pick a great movie. I was really stoked to get turned on to it. And I really think it was a very, very solid one. And again, Fangs and Infernos, I want to circle this back around to you that on behalf of myself and Devil, definitely check out Triangle. It's really, really cool. If you enjoyed what we talked about when it came to Happy Death Day, as well as Time Crimes, or if you enjoy those other movies in that ballpark, like a Freaky and things like that, then this movie is definitely going to be up your alley and it's definitely worth checking out. But ultimately, in the big picture of this episode, victory to the devil as Triangle with an 8.0 takes out Ghost Ship at a 7.5. And that is how it shall be forever and always. And on constant loop, 7.5 falls to an 8. We appreciate you. We love you, Fangs. We love you, Infernos. As always, shop till you drop through rockinghorror.com. Our friends Mark and Lizzie take care of all of the exclusive Vampire and Devil podcast merch. That's where you can get your shopping on for tees, tanks, hats, hoodies, all that fun stuff. We always like to show some love, of course, to our friend Chris, who owns the Buffalo Bill House in Perryopolis, Pennsylvania, from Silence of the Lambs. And make sure that you're checking out, vacation stuff there. But also with things that you may or may not have noticed, it's not that far out from the Monroeville Mall, and there's a petition going out right now to save that mall. As you guys may or may know or may not know, that is where Dawn of the Dead was filmed. So we definitely want to be able to protect all historical landmarks. So definitely check out the Buffalo Bill Museum, Buffalo Bill House for the ability to stay overnight and enjoy yourself. And then, of course, if you love creepy decor, we got our friends at Twisted Vines, great tea products from our friends at Brutalities, so many great partners and sponsors of the VNDP that we really, really absolutely appreciate. But that's going to be it for us for right now there, Fangs and Infernos, but we will be back. Horns up. Fangs out. Devil, my friend, I think it's time that we spill the tea. Brutalities. Vampire and Devil podcast couldn't be more excited, more humbled to let you all know that we have partnered with very dear friends of ours for a long time in Brutalities. And there's so much great stuff, so many flavors, so much to enjoy, and we're going to talk to you a little bit about it. Isn't that right there, my friend?
Oh yeah, we like it hot. Of course the Inferno likes it hot. Do you like the hot tea? Well, you might as well get some Brutality. Yeah, horror movies, puns, rock and roll, Brutality's got it all.
Absolutely. When it comes to the vampire, you know that he's going to absolutely gravitate towards that Nosferatu or that Nosferatu brew. Absolutely a favorite of mine. And we got to show a little bit love to, by all means, the biggest franchise in horror right now. That would be Terrifier. So Brutalities has brought you Terrifier. But that's just from the vampire. The devil has some favorites of his own.
Oh yeah, do you like the movie Pumpkinhead? Well, how about a little pumpkin bread for your throat holes? And like I said, with the rock and roll fans and the horror fans, Wednesday 13 fans, do you like Wednesday 13 and tea? How about a couple of those? With the Summertime Suicide and a couple other ones too. So if you like Wednesday 13 and you like the tea and you like the Brutalities, go to the website.
Absolutely. And so, of course, we like to look out for those that look out for us. We love you, Fangs. We love you, Infernos. But as a courtesy from Brutalities to be bestowed on you, we have that Vampire and Devil coupon code, don't we, my friend?
Oh yeah, you want to save a little dough, little cheddar, maybe buy some more shit? Go on the line, Brutalities, type in Vampire and Devil, and you get 10% off your order. Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, definitely. So it's getting into the chilly weather. People need to warm their bones. They need to warm what little skin they may or may not have. But Brutalities is the way to get it done. So that's the way it's gonna be because Vampire and Devil said so. Horns up, fangs out for Brutalities. What's up there, Fangs and Infernos? Vampire here with brand new Coffin Nails for you. And I thought I'd do something a little different this time. I stumbled across this movie called The Vampire Project that had a little bit of a documentarian feel to it. It's not a documentary, but it just kind of had that like film student style to it. When I found that to be actually pretty interesting. So anyway, this movie's from 1995, and basically the gist of it is that it is two, up and coming filmmakers that end up putting hidden cameras in like the illegal like underground world of nightclubs, and of course in typical fashion they stumble across a vampire's nightclub, which does not go over with us too well, especially when you're uninvited. You make us have to be invited into your places, but you will come in uninvited to ours. That's not how we do things. And consequences will be happening. And that's how Adrian comes in, who starts coming after Michelle and making them pay a little bit of a finder's fee, as you might say, when it comes to being in a place that they don't belong in. But look, overall, it's an interesting movie. It's actually on the shorter side. It's less than an hour. It's about 50 minutes long. But again, it has that kind of like film student style to it, like something that, you'd be doing in like high school or college for like a final project or something. But it's got an interesting opening kill, kind of campy, but basically has their vampire hunter who, jams like a stake, a cross made out of a stake, through the mouth of a vampire and leaves them just kind of like awkwardly bleeding with this kind of comical look on their face lying on the ground, so not a very, very nice thing to do to my fellow brethren, but we'll have to talk about that another time. But anyway, this movie's fun enough, check it out or whatever. It's not going to get a high score, I'm going to give it a 5, but it has a little bit of what you need to like be good enough at lore to make things go properly. So I feel like I can give an extra little half point or point for that. But, it's definitely a below average shot. You can tell that there's not a lot of money behind it. But anyway, check it out if you feel inclined, again, because it is on the shorter side. So a 5 is what The Vampire Project gets. See you next time. Ghouls and Fangs. Vampire and the Devil here. We got a little question for you. Devil, there's kind of a triangle, a three-headed monster per se, when it comes to Baltimore, that I don't think people necessarily realize. We've got Edgar Allan Poe, we've got John Waters, but what else do we have?
We got the Ouija boards, oh yeah.
Absolutely. Starting in Baltimore way back in the day, a lot of people are unfamiliar with William Fuld and Elijah Bond, who patented, and the birth of the Ouija board was right here in Baltimore. Devil and Vampire coming at you from the Witchboard Museum of Baltimore, courtesy of our friend John Kozik, who invited us out to check it out and shoot a little conversation action to let you guys all know. Of course, you've seen on our socials that we have partnered with both museums, and we couldn't be more appreciative to John for that opportunity. So whenever you're here in Baltimore, of course, right attached to the Bazaar Oddity Shop off of the Avenue, you have Witchboard Museum Baltimore. And when you're in Witch City, USA, up in Salem, Massachusetts, that's when you get to visit the Salem Witchboard Museum.
Oh yeah, if you want to see some cool stuff, see some cool boards, get some cool history, go see our boy John. Man, that guy is really awesome, man. That dude knows his boards, he knows his history, he's about preserving the society of witch boards and the talking boards and all that goodness. And we love it. We love the fact that, they were gonna bring in this museum here in Baltimore, so all the Baltimore fans or all your East Coast fans or maybe not as far away, going up to Salem, come out to Baltimore and check it out, you know what I mean? Because there's some cool stuff in this museum, and you gotta check it out, because the devil and the vampire said so.
That is Facts right there, my friend. Again, absolutely attached to the Bizarre Oddities shop in the Avenue in Hamden for the Baltimore established Witchboard Museum, or off of Essex Street in Salem, Massachusetts for the Salem Witchboard Museum. Horns up, fangs out.